Before humans redrew the map of North America, bison were the dominant species across this land. Tens of millions moved like a living current, helping shape soil structure, regulate vegetation, and create the conditions for biodiversity to develop. But in less than a century, bison were nearly wiped out by humans. As they disappeared, the grasslands began to decline. Areas that were once green gradually became dry and ecologically unstable. More than 100 years later, a bold experiment was carried out, returning bison to degraded lands. The results showed clear signs of recovery in just about a decade, as entire ecosystems gradually began to rebuild. In today's video, Mandarin Tech explores the return of the bison, a species once on the brink of extinction, yet one that may change the ecological future of North America. Before Europeans arrived, North America was a continent that possessed one of the largest grassland ecosystems on Earth, a vast prairie belt stretching from southern Canada all the way to northern Mexico. Covering millions of square miles, it was more than just grassland. It was the biological foundation that sustained an entire continent. Within that ecosystem, bison played a central role. Their herd movements, trampling, and cyclical grazing created a continuous cycle of impact on soil, vegetation, and nutrient flows, allowing the ecosystem to operate in a stable state over long periods of time. However, beginning in the 16th century, as Europeans expanded westward, this balance rapidly collapsed. In less than 100 years, the bison population fell from an estimated 60 million animals to just a few hundred. This was not only the result of hunting for meat and hides, but also a deliberate strategy aimed at destroying the livelihoods of indigenous communities that depended on bison. When bison disappeared, the grasslands lost their own architect. The land was overfarmed and compacted by confined livestock. Native grasses were replaced by fragile monocultures, causing soil microbial systems to collapse. By the 1930s, these accumulated impacts erupted into the Dust Bowl when topsoil was blown away across vast regions, leaving dead land that persisted for decades. North America was forced to confront a clear truth. Grasslands cannot survive without the very species that created them. At the beginning of the 21st century, many land restoration programs across North America found themselves stuck in prolonged deadlock. For decades, humans had tried every familiar solution: chemical fertilizers, deep plowing, reseeding grasses, even large-scale land modification using heavy machinery. But the results were often short-lived, as the soil quickly degraded once again. In this context, a group of ecologists proposed an idea that ran counter to conventional thinking. Instead of continuing to fix the land from the outside, they asked a different question. What had kept the grasslands stable for thousands of years before human intervention? The answer led them back to bison, a species that had disappeared from much of the North American landscape. Reintroducing bison was not intended as a simple conservation effort, but as a large-scale ecological experiment. Notably, bison were not released into ideal conditions, but into landscapes considered failures: dry, nutrient-poor, and almost entirely devoid of native grasses. To many, this was a risky gamble. No one could be certain that a species once adapted to vast seas of grass could survive on land that was nearly dead. Almost immediately after the bison herd was released, events began to move beyond the researchers' expectations. In the early days, tracking signals showed constant movement, but soon the data became fragmented. GPS collars on several individuals gradually lost signal. Drones flew for hours without capturing clear imagery. Even helicopter surveys detected only faint traces. For weeks, the bison herd seemed to disappear from the tracking maps. There were no carcasses, no clear signs that the animals had left the area, yet no one could confirm that they were still alive. In reality, they were moving toward higher ground, where vegetation was almost non-existent. No one understood why the herd was doing this. Their sudden disappearance meant the entire project was on the brink of collapse. More than $10 million in research at risk, and around 250 scientists facing the loss of their jobs. It threatened to derail what was considered the most ambitious ecological restoration effort in decades. But to understand why the bison behave this way, we need to look at the very nature of the species. Bison are not animals that adapt through complex learning or flexible behavior like some primates. Instead, they possess a survival instinct refined over tens of thousands of years. When living in a safe environment, they reveal a completely different side. Curious, observant, almost like a child discovering the world for the first time. From their earliest days, bison calves learn to swim, with their mothers always close behind, ready to enter cold water if danger arises. This blend of courage, persistence, herd protection, and quiet curiosity is what makes bison such effective ecological engineers, even though they never intended to become one. In an environment without hunting pressure, bison do not behave like domesticated livestock, instead splitting into small groups and moving into remote terrain. Their apparent disappearance was not a failure, but an ancient survival strategy, one that reactivated ecological processes long forgotten by humans. It was these deeply ingrained instincts that ultimately explained what happened next. The disappearance of the herd was not a warning sign at all, but the earliest signal that the bison had successfully adapted and had begun doing exactly what ecological engineers do best, repairing the land beneath their feet. Unlike cattle, which often linger in one area and compress the soil into hard, lifeless surfaces, bison are in constant motion. They rarely remain in a single location for long. Each step they take gently breaks up the surface, loosening compacted soil and creating tiny channels that allow rainwater to penetrate rather than flow away. Along their routes, bison leave behind dung that quickly becomes a natural fertilizer. Rich in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, it replenishes nutrients that native grasses had been deprived of for decades. These deposits help restart soil chemistry that had long been exhausted. When bison roll on the ground, their nearly 1-ton bodies press shallow hollows into the earth. These depressions trap moisture, catching seeds as they fall and creating small sheltered pockets where new plants can take root. Spread across the prairie, these micro-nurseries function like natural reservoirs, slowing water loss and protecting fragile seedlings. Rolling behavior also strips away dead vegetation, exposing bare soil. Exactly the conditions seeds need to germinate. Many of those seeds arrive carried in the animal's thick fur, transported naturally across the landscape. Crucially, bison never overgraze. Their constant movement leaves patches of land undisturbed long enough to recover and regenerate. Through this repeating cycle, the prairie began to heal. Starting with the very first tracks the herd pressed into the soil. The first changes appeared quietly. After 3 years, small green patches began to emerge across land that had once been considered hopeless. By the 4th year, native grasses returned in force, and by the 10th year, drone footage captured a scene few believed possible. A landscape once close to desert had transformed into a vibrant, living grassland filled with color. As vegetation returned, wildlife followed. Bird species absent for 20 to 30 years began to reappear. Pollinating insects came back, along with many small mammals. Soon after, predators such as foxes, coyotes, and bobcats started to reestablish themselves in the area. The soil began retaining moisture more effectively. Streams that once dried up during the summer now held water for longer periods. It was as if the ecosystem had remembered how it once functioned when bison were present, and had begun restoring itself, guided by processes shaped over thousands of years of evolution. Long-term research at the Kanza Prairie in Kansas shows that in areas where bison were present, plant species richness increased by up to 86% over more than 3 decades. Meanwhile, areas grazed only by cattle saw increases of around 30%, while regions without any grazers were the least diverse of all. These findings demonstrate that the ecological role of bison cannot be replaced by any other species. Even cattle, despite their similar appearance, cannot generate the same effects, as they tend to remain in one place for too long, compacting the soil, breaking its structure, and accelerating erosion. Across North America, regions where bison have been reintroduced are now expanding. The Tallgrass Prairie Preserve in Oklahoma, once a cattle ranch, has become the largest restored tallgrass prairie in the world. Its bison herd has grown from just 300 individuals to nearly 2,000. In Montana, the American Prairie Project aims to establish a wildlife corridor spanning more than 3.2 million acres, supporting a population of around 10,000 bison. In Mexico, where bison had completely disappeared since the 19th century, a herd reintroduced from just 23 individuals in 2009 has now grown to more than 200, helping revive the entire Llanos grassland. In many regions, including Illinois, abandoned industrial zones have also been transformed back into prairie ecosystems following the return of bison. In reality, not every landscape can simply release bison and wait for a miracle. Many regions also require fire, because fire was an essential component of prairie ecosystems for thousands of years. In Oklahoma, land managers burn roughly 1/3 of the reserve each year to mimic natural conditions. Fire removes dead vegetation, triggers strong regrowth of young grasses, and creates ideal food sources for bison. When bison and fire operate together under this ancient ecological pattern, the prairie revives far more powerfully than through any artificial method. Data collected after 10 years of bison reintroduction shows soil moisture increasing by 25 to 40% after rainfall, erosion decreasing by nearly half, and plant species richness rising by 70 to 80%, depending on the region. Remarkably, areas that had once lost nearly all vegetation have now become hotspots of biodiversity. What is most striking is that no technology, no irrigation systems, and no artificial fertilizers were behind this transformation. Everything was achieved simply through the presence of bison and the natural processes they have followed for thousands of years. The success of bison restoration projects raises a larger question. What would happen if millions of bison, like those that once roamed the continent, were allowed to return across North America? Could the Great Plains regain their historic form? Could soil erosion, land degradation, and even aspects of climate change be reduced simply by letting nature do its job? What is certain is that bison have accomplished what humans failed to achieve after hundreds of years of soil management. They transformed landscapes once considered dead into living ecosystems. Their return shows that ecological restoration does not always depend on expensive technologies, but on understanding how natural systems function and restoring the missing pieces. Yet the greatest irony lies in the present. Today, roughly 95% of bison exist only as commercial products of the meat industry, while just 5% remain as true ecological engineers. The only individuals still capable of reviving an entire prairie. The bison meat industry in the United States is now worth more than $350 million annually, with demand rising steadily by 10 to 15% each year. This growth is driven by bison's reputation as a high-protein, low-cholesterol superfood. However, this economic value has pushed most bison into industrial farming systems, unintentionally reducing the chances for a species that once shaped an entire continent to recover naturally. The story of the bison is not just the story of a species making a comeback. It is a reminder that in nature, the most effective solutions do not always come from high technology or aggressive intervention, but from restoring the relationships that have existed for thousands of years. In a world facing desertification, climate change, and large-scale land degradation, the lesson of the bison extends far beyond North America. It raises a larger question for humanity. Will we continue trying to control nature, or will we learn to work with it? If you find stories about science, technology, and ecology like this worth sharing, Please like, share, and subscribe to Mandarin Tech, where the complex stories of our world are told in a clear, insightful, and inspiring way.